But both of us are going to be talking a lot about this idea of reentry. And our agenda for today is to talk about what reentry is and why it's important. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about my research with social networks. And then Candalyn's going to talk a little bit about the research she's done for community acceptance of reentry. And really, we'd like to just open it up at that point to talk to everyone about their reactions to what we've presented, as well as any questions or thoughts about future directions for the research. So I don't have to tell this group that the costs of mass incarceration are steep, and that it is a growing, not only economic, but social problem. Re-entering prisoners effectively into the community is one of the main ways, other than policy change, that we can lower our prison populations. So what we want to do is prevent recidivism by allowing people to re-enter communities in adaptive ways. Most prisoners will be released at some point. They are challenged by a number of different things, including employment, other kinds of community issues, and recidivism is often very high for people who have been released from prison. There are a number of policy reasons for that. One of the main ones is the 1994 Omnibus Crime Bill, which discontinued funding for Pell Grants and education while in prison. There's also a lot of policy that is affected by the Department of Justice in terms of how they prosecute crimes and how they seek sentencing for those crimes. Under the Obama administration, and specifically Eric Holder, there was a policy called Smart on Crime, which really de-emphasized nonviolent drug offenses and encouraged federal prosecutors not to maximize sentencing for those crimes. It was not prescriptive necessarily. It was guidance from the Department of Justice. But as we, many of us probably have heard, the new attorney, Jeff Sessions, has rescinded Smart on Crime and has continued to ask federal prosecutors to maximize sentences, which really, a lot of the gains that we've seen in the reductions in federal prison populations are likely to be reversed with that kind of policy. The difficulty with policy is probably one that should have its own webinar, so we won't spend a whole lot of time on that. But one of the ways that we can look at reentry is through the role of social networks. And what social networks do in terms of helping prisoners re-enter communities is it is really related to social capital. It talks a lot about how building those relationships and making those relationships helpful in terms of keeping people close to their networks and increasing that trust and helping them navigate through the social norms that they have unlearned in prison and then have to relearn when they enter communities is really important to helping them succeed. The difficulty is that a lot of programs are very resource intensive, and so things like reentry courts, some of the other programs that Candalyn might talk about a little bit later, are very, like I said, resource intensive. So they take a lot of time and capital, and if communities aren't in a place where they're ready to accept that, then social networks are really the fallback for how people learn how to move about their communities after coming out of prison. So what I did is I wanted to look at specifically offenders re-entering communities in Kansas. I partnered with federal probation for the District of Kansas, and we did a two-phase research project looking at social networks for these individuals. I created a social network survey, which was an ego-centered survey. We did not ask a lot about their individual alters other than how they related to the offenders themselves. And what we were really trying to understand was, is there a relationship between how many relationships these offenders had, what kinds of relationships these offenders had, and whether they were pro-social or anti-social networks that related to recidivism or recidivist behaviors. And those recidivist behaviors were operationalized as positive urinalysis tests, rearrest, and non-compliance incidents. And then there were a couple of subgroups that we wanted to look at, specifically whether geographic location. We have offices for federal probation in Kansas City. We have one in Topeka, and then we have one in Wichita. And so we wanted to see if there were regional differences between sort of the Topeka, Kansas City group, the Wichita group, and then obviously there's a lot of space outside of those areas that are more rural in nature, and to see if those relationships were a little bit different in those rural areas. We also wanted to know whether or not the relationships were different between people who lived in a residential reentry center first, and then also if there were differences between those who participated in groups, specifically an intervention that federal probation in Kansas has been very excited about. It's called moral recognition therapy, MRT, and it's a cognitive behavioral therapy based intervention that is intended to help people recenter their moral compass based on how they view trust in those relationships that they currently have. So those were kind of the subgroups we were looking at. The follow-up data that allowed me to look at the recidivist behaviors I just mentioned was actually just secondary data that came out of the pretrial the acronym is PACS. It's Probation and Pretrial Automated Case Tracking System. So there'll be a quiz about that later. And I just really kind of wanted to explore what those relationships look like compared to the outcome data. And so this is sort of a simplification of what I found. The interesting thing, I think, is that one of the questions I was interested in was size. And there's this sort of, I would say, it's not only based in the literature, but it's also sort of this tribal knowledge that the bigger your network, the better your outcomes are going to be. And I found zero relationship between network size and whether or not recidivist behavior was exhibited by these offenders. What did seem to have some influence was how close they felt to their networks. So irrespective of size, if they had high degrees of closeness, then they were less likely to recidivate. In terms of what those relationships looked like, birth families were closer to the offenders than immediate family. And part of the reason for that is that there's some work having been done around the community effects of incarceration. And so a lot of that centers on the immediate family, which is defined as significant others and children, versus birth families, which would be parents and siblings. And birth families seemed to be much more salient in terms of closeness than immediate families. And there's some discussion in the literature about, because of the traumatic effects of having someone removed from a family due to incarceration, that immediate family bond is stressed and traumatized as well. And so that could account for some of those differences in birth family versus immediate family. And then, so between birth family and immediate family were friends in terms of closeness. There were differences in location. So the network variables that I looked at, the closeness, the degree to which people in those relationships could be helpful, how they made the ego feel, so self-image, and then also the likelihood that they felt like those relationships were going to get them into trouble. All four of those network variables were much more influential or much more related to recidivist behavior in the rural communities than they were in the more urban communities. So that was an interesting finding one that I wasn't necessarily expecting, actually. There could be some logical reasons behind that, but I don't have causal information to put to that. And the participation in the groups, other social groups such as like church and sports groups and school groups, were not as influential as the MRT or the moral recognition therapy group. Obviously, some caution needs to be taken in the sense that these groups were not equal. They were pretty unevenly sized, but there did seem to be some additional layers of contemplation going on between evaluating what a relationship could do for someone in the MRT group versus the not. So this was an exploratory study. I'm hoping to be able to follow up with some additional contextual information and maybe even some more study around these networks and get more information on the alters themselves. But that's sort of what I found just in this first initial study. And having said that communities are really important, especially given that the locations themselves seem to be an important piece of what I found, I can now toss it to Candalyn to talk a little bit about what community support for reentry looked like with her. Candalyn, you're on mute.
Okay, can y'all hear me now? Okay, great. So I'm going to tell you a little bit of a different side of this reentry process, like Nicole mentioned. So represented here are just some of the language and the images that we hear and see about people who have been involved in the criminal justice system. So whether it's labels of things like ex-con or felon, that kind of stick around with people after they've been released and returned to the community, or just the language that we see. So things like talking about the danger associated with hiring people who've been involved with the criminal system. So these are a lot of the common barriers that folks encounter when they're returning to the community. So I've done some work looking at what these barriers to reentry entail. So whether we're talking about things like difficulty obtaining employment or housing, there are barriers related to healthcare, and we know there's different barriers related to voting rights. And so what the previous literature would suggest is that this level of stigma and the stereotypes that we have kind of are across all of these barriers. So we see how stigma and stereotypes affect employment, how it affects housing, how it can affect healthcare. And so this is what I'm focusing on for today, is what we can know, how we can understand more about the stigma toward folks who have been involved in the criminal justice system, and what we can do to address that. And so I'm basing this on implicit theory, which comes from social psychology. And so just to give you a little recap of this theory, it suggests that there's two different mindsets of how we are thinking about people, and how we think about ourselves in terms of our ability to change and to grow. So this growth mindset would suggest that we think both ourselves, other people, have this ability to change and to grow. It might take a lot of hard work, there's a lot of effort that's involved, but that this type of growth is possible. Whereas that fixed mindset is more consistent with the idea that you are who you are, your personality, your attributes might not change. So this would be consistent with that idea of kind of once a criminal, always a criminal, that successful reentry and rehabilitation might not be possible. Now these can be domain specific. So I might think about a fixed mindset about criminal behavior, or a growth mindset about my intellectual ability, or this can vary. So I was really wanting to look at it in terms of how do we think about someone's involvement in criminal behavior and their ability to involve in successful rehabilitation, successful community reentry. So what we have predicted is that those with a growth mindset would have less stigma toward folks who've been involved in the criminal justice system when they're re-entering the community, and then therefore be more likely to support reentry programming and more likely to support reentry policy. Whereas those with this fixed mindset have more stigma and are less likely to support reentry program, reentry policy, because this idea of if people can't change, then why would we invest in reentry programming? versus of thinking that people can change and have the ability to successfully reenter the community, then more support for programming and policy that would facilitate that. And so this theory is based on the work of Carol Dweck in other contexts and looking how can we apply that to this idea of reentry into the community. And so we've run this on a couple of different samples, tested out the model. And so the one I'm presenting to you right now was from a sample of adults using MTurk. If you're familiar with Amazon MTurk, can you actually go back one, Nicole? Thank you. So a sample of Amazon MTurk participants, if you're familiar with that, people can go online to Amazon, participate in a research study or do different tasks. They get paid a small amount to do so. And it allowed for access to a broader, more diverse sample rather than using student polls or that sort of thing. And so that's where this data come from. And so what we had them do was read these short articles. It's just one page, looks like something you might see in something like Psychology Today, or we had this labeled as Science Observer. So just like a one-page little article that either the overarching point was that criminal behavior is stable, it's like plaster, stable over time, or that it's changeable. And everything in this article was exactly the same. The names were the same, the stories were the same, except the outcomes of all of the research suggested that people could successfully reenter the community, that this behavior was changeable, or that it wasn't. So the content was the same, the names of the examples, all of that identical, just the overall message was different. So we had people read this and then measure to see if that influenced their mindsets regarding criminal behavior in particular, and just overall this idea of whether people could grow or change. We found that we were successfully able to prime their mindset. So just from reading this one-page little article, if someone read the growth mindset one, then they were more likely to have a growth mindset about criminal behavior, so think that people can change, and a general mindset about this idea that people can grow and change. So we had this successful kind of priming intervention, and then followed that up to see how did that influence attitudes toward people who had been incarcerated, and then support for reentry. So can you go on to the next slide now? Thank you. So we found that those with this, after participating in reading the article, that priming activity, that those with a growth mindset then reported more positive attitudes toward ex-offenders. So this relationship between what we have as the first box and the second box here was significant. Growth mindset reported more positive attitudes toward ex-offenders. Those with a fixed mindset reported more negative attitudes. And then we also had a significant relationship directly from attitudes that they had toward support for reentry. So thank you. So those who reported more positive attitudes also were more likely to report being supportive of reentry programming and policy, and vice versa. So those with more negative attitudes were less supportive of reentry programming and policy. So we had this mediation pathway here that growth mindsets led to more positive attitudes, which then led to greater support for reentry. And we also saw that some other demographic variables were important from other previous studies. So things like political orientation, religious beliefs, belief in a just world, contact with someone who had been involved in the criminal justice system did start to be important here at the first step, but then we lost that with the second step of the model. So this is how we were initially testing this effect, that growth mindsets led to more positive attitudes, which then led to support for reentry. But as we know, all people who have been involved in the criminal justice system are not the same. And in particular, we see a lot of disparities based on race and ethnicity. So there are, if we look at just the differences between white adults and Black adults, the lifetime imprisonment rate for white adults is 1.4%. versus 8.9 for African American adults in the US. And if we look just at African American males, that jumps up to 16.6. There's predictions based off of looking at expected incarceration rates in their lifetime that put that up to 1 in 3 for adult males and for adult Black males. And so we really see this racial disparity. And so I tested that to see if the race of the ex-offender mattered in terms of really understanding the role of growth mindsets and support for reentry. And so we predicted that people would generally report more negative attitudes toward Black ex-offenders compared to white ex-offenders, and also report less support for reentry based on those racial differences. But what we were hoping to see is that those associations would be weaker for folks in the growth mindset. And part of this is prior research in other domains related to implicit theory and this idea of mindsets would suggest that people who have a growth mindset are more likely to consider the situation, more likely to consider factors that might be involved outside of the person, so the context, the situation, the effort, the motivation, those sorts of factors, whereas people who tend to have a fixed mindset about an aspect focus more on dispositional characteristics, so what's internal to the person. And so we're thinking that those with a growth mindset would be more likely to consider situational factors rather than attributing everything to the individual. And so we found partial support for some of these hypotheses. So we did find that overall, people reported more negative attitudes toward Black ex-offenders compared to white ex-offenders. But we didn't see a difference based on support for reentry. So overall, that did not have an effect based on race. But we did find this moderated mediation effect, which is what's demonstrated here on the screen, which basically means that for those who were in the growth mindset intervention, so they read the little article about growth mindset saying that people who are involved in the criminal justice system can change, they can successfully re-enter the community without recidivating and returning to the criminal justice system. So when they read that and were more likely to have that growth mindset, they reported significantly more positive attitudes toward Black ex-offenders compared to those in the fixed mindset. So basically, we didn't see as much of this racial difference in terms of attitudes toward ex-offenders when someone came from that growth mindset. So it almost acted like a buffer in a way, that by having a growth mindset, the race of the ex-offender wasn't as important when we were looking at support for their reentry and attitudes toward those ex-offenders. And so we saw this difference, specifically looking at Black ex-offenders, but not for white ex-offenders. But then the same pattern was true from growth mindsets, talking about more support for reentry through this idea of more positive attitudes toward ex-offenders. So our general takeaway from this is that we are able to kind of improve attitudes toward criminal justice reentry by providing information about the success of reentry. And when we have examples of successful reentry programs and how that has been implemented in the past. And we did have support for this pathway that mindsets help us to understand general attitudes and then support for reentry programming. And so I'm continuing this work, and I'm going to share with y'all some work that I have in progress right now. So I don't have the results on it, but can tell you kind of what we're anticipating and how planning to merge these two theories together. So to build on that, now that we know a little bit about how mindsets influence these attitudes and support for reentry, then there's also this need to understand how that affects the specific stereotypes we have about ex-offenders in terms of the perceptions that we have of them, and thinking specifically about how that might influence employment. And so I've talked about how employment is one of those barriers that's influenced by stigma. And so what you have demonstrated up here comes from stereotype content model and this bias map, also from social psychology, where it's suggesting that we have these two stereotypes about people. It's whether they're warm or when they're competent. And so there's some examples up here. We tend to think about warmth and competent, having feelings of pride toward those folks. So students, as an example there, or we might see different combinations. So having pity for someone who we see as warm and competent, like the elderly. And down in this corner, we have those people who we see as being low in warmth and low in competence. And so examples we see there are people who are homeless, people who have substance use addictions. And so that's where I hypothesize that we will see the formerly incarcerated, that they will be in that bottom corner, thinking that they are low in warmth and low in competence. And so then the idea is whether or not people with this growth mindset, because the growth mindset was able to help improve the overall attitudes, whether that can also help us address this low warmth and low confidence. So kind of putting the two together to see if growth mindsets can also help improve these idea of warmth and confidence, particularly as this might affect thinking about employment of ex-offenders, because this confidence, the bottom part there in particular, would be important as we're thinking about employment. So how can we use this growth mindset framework to help improve perceptions, particularly in terms of confidence, and the effect that that might have on some of these reentry outcomes. So if you'll go to the next slide for me, Nicole, please. Thank you. And so we see some particular behavioral response attached with these. So whether there's this passive or active harming or passive and active facilitation. And so that's where some of those behaviors might come into play in terms of our behavioral response to people involved in the criminal justice system, whether it's actively supporting policy related to reentry, actively supporting reentry programming, volunteering in a reentry program locally, being willing to hire someone or interview someone who has previous involvement in the criminal justice system. And so starting to see how just having that growth mindset might then influence the stereotypes that we have about people involved in the criminal justice system, and then the subsequent behavior, ideally toward facilitation and toward assisting that reentry process. And so I don't have results for you on this added piece of warmth and confidence, so stay tuned. Hopefully we'll have that in the next while. We're collecting data on that right now. But this is where we hope to extend the application of this. And so just kind of some takeaway points for us, if you'll go to the next one, please. Thank you. So generally what we found so far is that these growth mindsets are associated with more support for reentry. So these more positive attitudes overall, support for reentry programming and policy, and that perhaps fostering these growth mindsets might not only increase that support for reentry, but also can be a point for helping to reduce endorsement of some of these particular stereotypes. And so it leaves open a lot of room for future work in terms of particularly trying to focus on ways to foster growth mindsets. So are there online trainings we can provide perhaps to employers in terms of helping to facilitate this growth mindset, being more likely to hire or interview someone who has a criminal record, or other ways that we might be able to use this idea of fostering growth mindsets to reduce some of the stereotypes and improve support for reentry. So that's where I currently am and hoping to head with this work as we go along. And so now Nicole and I just have some kind of questions for us to kind of discuss. I think we both would love any feedback or questions or comments that you have. And so really, for both of us, we're looking at how can we improve this community reentry process. There's a lot of barriers that are present, looking from whether it's social support systems, stigma, stereotyping, maybe we need to look at prison-based programming and transitioning, other ideas. So I think we're just kind of curious in feedback, comments, whatever y'all would like to discuss from here. We'd really enjoy talking about it.
Great, thank you all so much. I always have questions or comments or things I could contribute. But before that, I wanted to just open it up to other folks to see if you have any reactions, questions, responses to some of the questions that Candalyn and Nicole have already framed for us.
I'm kind of like you, Jessica. I have voice on something, lots of questions. Nicole, I was struck by, because I work with teens, never occurs to me to think about the distinction between different types of, immediate versus family of origin, because they haven't partnered. I mean, if they partnered, we don't take it seriously, at that age. But I'd be interested in hearing a little bit more about what you mean by kind of like what you think about those distinctions and the kind of network closeness of these different levels, why you think it might matter more, and also thrown in that question is kind of about what age range are most of your sample, or is it, do you think there are effects dependent on age?
Yeah, so the mean age of my sample was 42. So these are folks that are pretty well established in life in terms of having had a significant amount of experience, and potentially relationship experience, right? So folks who potentially have been married and divorced, and even maybe more than once. I think the distinction that seems to be playing out, and again, because I didn't do, it's exploratory, so a lot of it is actually even more qualitative than it is quantitative. But what seems to be playing out is this idea that the family you're born into, so your birth family, you have higher expectations for them to be accepting and trustworthy over time, as opposed to sort of the acquisition of relationships. And so many of the people who also reported having children and being close to their children had children who were, I presume, younger, only because they said that these children could not help them. And so one of the questions that I asked is, how likely or how able is this person to provide help to you? And it was on a Likert scale of they can help me anytime significantly, to the middle was they can help me in an emergency only, to they can't help me at all. And so a lot of the people who reported having children were in the they can't help me at all. And I assume that in some respects that has to do with the age of the children themselves. I did not ask alter demographic questions, so I don't have conclusive evidence to that. But from what I see in the literature in terms of the community effects of incarceration is that the acquired relationships having to do with significant others are more easily damaged than the birth relationships that the family you're born into. And so that maybe is an area to move into for building and growing social support networks. It could also be, I know a lot of programs across the country also work on relationship counseling to sort of build those other sort of acquired relationships as opposed to the birth relationships. I don't know if that answers your question, but.
Oh, it does. Thank you. And it's even more interesting to think that that's an older mean than I thought you were going to say.
Yeah.
That it's 42 and still at that stage, those bonds from, family of origin are stronger.
Mm-hmm. And that could be combination too. Kansas could be somewhat unique in the sense of continued familial relationships, as opposed to the coasts. I don't have any data to suggest that, but it's a possibility.
Yeah, I mean, it's all, you never know based on your context. But it does, to me, I think it's interesting because we focus so much on strengthening family relationships for kids. It's a natural thing, and then for adults, we do all the marital stuff. But why not consider with adults, what's your relationship with your parents like? Even if you're 40, is that a resource for you?
I also do, this is completely unrelated, but sort of tangential, and this is the direction it makes my mind go, but I do some work with early childhood, and the ability of the parent to call upon resources from their relationship with their parents in order to be good parents to their children is a big factor in early childhood success when it comes to education. So I don't know why it wouldn't be a factor when we're talking about something like reentry.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense too. Nicole, I just had a quick, I think is a quick, just somewhat related question. How were the lines drawn between the nodes? So I know like when you're doing social network analysis, you could have a different prompt that builds that network. So like what was the question that they were answering to build those connections?
The name generator was actually a two-stage name generator. there were 5 specific types of relationships that were asked for. So it asked about immediate family, it asked about birth family, it asked about friends, it asked about extended family, it asked about acquaintances, and then it asked about professional relationships. And so they could name up to 5 people in each of those categories and answer the questions about closeness, communication, help, all of that for each of those. And then the second stage was basically, is there anybody you missed? Because after you think about these different parts of your life, there was a real possibility that someone might come up in the context of those other things. And so they could list up to 10 additional people. And then there was the programming on this was a little complicated, but they could identify then the types of relationships in that all other category. And then it was up to me on the back end to clean all that up and push them into the right places. So the name generator was a little complex on the back end in order to make it as easy for the people taking the survey to take it. Initially, I had a draft of the survey where the name generator was, give me 25 people, all in the front. And the concern was that 25 blank spaces was going to be intimidating for this particular group of people. And so we wanted to try and reduce the difficulty in taking it. And so therefore, it made the programming a little more complicated on that end.
Nicole, I was wondering, did you get any data on how much those immediate family relationships had deteriorated while the person was incarcerated? So is your partner dating somebody else? Is there a restraining order so that you're not allowed to even talk to your partner or your kids? So, because I would think that those relationships, people are much more likely in the immediate family are much more likely to walk away and say, I'm moving on with my life and there's no role for you in it now, as opposed to birth family. You don't go out and find a new kid, you know, whereas you do go out and find a new partner, and in some cases kids go out and find new parents. So do you have any information about the deterioration of those relationships?
The short answer to your question is no. The triangulation of that would be the degree of closeness or the degree of help or self-image that a particular alter was described as. I'm going to go out on a limb and say that the people for whom those relationships really deteriorated were not listed as alters. So I think that because the wording of the prompt, and this may actually be more of what Jessica was asking, it was list the people in X category that you talk with about important things. And so if that significant other has a restraining order, you're obviously not going to talk about important things with that person. So I think that would be a really good follow-up to understand maybe the people who weren't mentioned, or to get a little more context around those relationships for immediate family, because you're right. I think that was a big contributor to feeling close to your birth family, because that's the only one you got and there's not a whole lot you can do about it. Whereas the acquired relationships are ones that are a little, I don't want to say it's easy, but they're a little easier to acquire in different contexts.
And the incarcerated individual may still be viewing those as intact and may be released and gradually come to the realization that, no, this relationship has been damaged. And so there's that aspect too. I mean, there may be a little bit of wishful thinking on one side and unwillingness to cut it off completely on the other side.
Yeah, and it probably would have been interesting to have asked whether or not this person visited you in prison. That was not a question I did ask, but it might have been I'd have to go back and think about the likelihood that someone would answer that question in a non-social desirability biased way. But social desirability bias was somewhat of a difficulty in this process anyway. So, but that would have been an interesting thing to ask, is whether or not they had been visited by this person.
Yeah.
I had a question. I really liked the use of network analysis and thinking about support for these individuals. I've been thinking a lot about moving that up a level to the organizations. And so, like, we know that they leave prison with almost no resources or information about the resources they need. And then if you're considering people living with HIV, they also need all of these health resources and insurance and benefits that are difficult to get a hold of when you need housing and employment. So I just thought it'd be cool to do a network analysis of like which of these organizations and resources are connected and how we could improve the ties between the organizations rather than obviously, because there's a lot being done at the individual level, sort of moving that up. And I wondered if that's something you'd ever thought about in terms of like network analysis at that organizational level.
That was not something that had been a part of what I was working on, partly because the organization I was working with was, that was not their interest at the time. So the group that I partnered with was more interested in the individual level. However, having done social network analysis at the organizational level on other projects, I can tell you that the number of published instruments and frameworks associated with that is much greater than it is at the individual level. Fry, for example, that's F-R-E-Y, has a collaboration framework that is incredibly user-friendly and talks a lot about that collaboration piece, and could be, I think, applied in this context in a really interesting way, but that's not something I've done.
Okay, cool. Thank you for sharing that.
Nicole, I appreciate that resource. And Danielle, I might just comment to you. Hey, I'm Courtney. I'm over at the University of Kansas. We are doing that right now. So that's why I was rapidly writing down Nicole's reference to make sure that we look at it. We're doing it in two ways. We're doing it, one for Black male victims of crime in Kansas City, Missouri. And a separate project, we're doing it as it relates to youth violence in Kansas City, Kansas. But I think Nicole's point is good. The whole networks have been evaluated much more often and more frequently than the ego networks. So Nicole, I'm excited about your research, and I was eager to hear what you've been doing. So
thank you.
Cool. Thank you, Courtney.
And I think the organization piece is part of what makes Candalyn's research so exciting, because it's at that organization level that you start to see more of the difficulties that she's talking about in terms of community support, right? So I don't know, Candalyn, if you want to address some of that as well.
Yeah, so I can briefly, I haven't done the type of analysis y'all are talking about in terms of organizational networking, but I did work a while back on a project where we were just looking at what resources were actually available in the community. So we were assessing, was there a prevalence of this type of service and a lack in another type? And through that, we did a lot of interviews with the service providers. And so that's actually what led me to focusing on this area of stigma. Is that was the main thing that every service provider I talked to was that, the problem was related to either, having a mark on their record because they were involved in the criminal justice system, or, there's not enough housing available because of this, or they can't qualify for a certain type of benefit or entitlement because of having a specific record, or those type of elements. And so from more of that kind of qualitative conversation data that we had, and we did some focus groups around that, we found that stigma did seem to be a really pervasive problem, particularly related to housing and employment. And so it didn't really speak to how the networks are working, or how the organizations are networked and working together, but they did seem to have common concerns. And so I would see how maybe starting to piece that together, the networks would be interesting to see how that fits.
Candalyn, I had a question for you. So it looks like you're operationalization of mindset was experimentally manipulated, yes?
Yes.
I find that really fascinating because it seems like that in itself is a growth mindset, right? The idea that the way a person thinks about things could be so malleable. I wonder how you feel like that translates to things like influencing policymakers, or whoever it is who has to vote for these organizations. What would the extension of that be?
Yeah, and so that's the kind of the problem that I'm at right now is that so I didn't do a pre-test. It was just post-test only in terms of being able to alter the mindsets. So, but we did have pretty large significant differences between the two. And so, but I don't know how long it lasted, right? This was in the context of, an hour and a half total for this whole process. And so I don't know if I followed up with them now, 6 months, a year later, what the effect would be. So I think that the lasting effect of that is something that, in particular, the context that you're talking about, how that might affect policy and kind of decision makers in some way, would be an area that needs to be investigated more. There have been effective interventions to foster growth mindsets in other areas, though. So like education has done this. In some examples, there have been more long-term ways of how, if you even get into terms of things like adding some neuropsych elements in terms of like how our brains actually grow and can learn new things. And there's been a lot of work at making more long-term interventions rather than just kind of this priming thing that I did, that do have a longer term effect, but I haven't investigated that. So all of those that I've read that are pretty successful, though, are in terms of actually sitting down and engaging in an intervention, which you have to get someone to want to do, right? And I think that that's going to be my hardest problem or barrier facing this, is like, how do we actually get people on board with wanting to foster growth mindsets about reentry? And so I don't know if there's a way to shift that towards maybe like a public campaign, right, where we're just doing kind of public service announcements or something like that. And I don't know what that would look like, but I think it's an area to investigate, because we will have a hard time with people wanting to sit down and do a 30-minute intervention, for 6 weeks, one time a week or something like that. That would be more difficult to get people engaged in. So I think needs to explore ideas of what alternative ways of fostering growth mindsets could look like.
Yeah, I agree with your idea about more of like a public service announcement kind of thing. And even just your manipulation itself is an article, right?
Yeah.
And so the degree to which maybe journalists could be targeted for interventions and see if that can shift some of, how these things are talked about.
Yeah, I actually hadn't even thought about that, the way that just the written article-based things could be used. That's great. Thank you.
Candalyn, I had a related question to that as I was hearing you answer what Carolyn raised. Could you talk a little bit about the sample in which you did that study? Like, I'm just thinking about if there might be even generational differences, right? So where if this is, say, an undergraduate population where they read this article, they're already in a learning environment. So they read this and they take it kind of at face value, versus the world we're in now, right? Where like people are seeking out articles that support opinions they already have. So I don't know if you could talk about just like the broader culture we're in and how there might be generational differences too, and how willing people are to read something that's maybe different than what they think and give it some credence.
Yeah, so I did this in one student sample, but two MTurk samples. And so they're just people over the age of 18 living somewhere in the US who participated, and I paid them, I think it was like